Hey everybody, so today we're going to do a more advanced edge painting tutorial. I'm going to show you guys how I get, when I really want to get the edges nice and glossy, how I take that little bit of extra time and gloss them up really nice. Now, we did one video on edge painting using Weaver's roller. You can use the roller. I'm going to use just an awl, the traditional way, for this video to show you how it's done if you don't have the roller. We are going to be using Weaver's Exact Touch Edge Paint. I have actually really fallen in love with this edge paint. I have a bunch of other edge paints. This technique will work with other brands too. You do want to test it before you make a piece and do it, but this technique usually works with most other edge paints. So once we're all glued up here, I sanded this down nice and flat, you can see. So this, I guess this is like a controversial thing. I don't think it's very controversial, but a lot of people don't bevel their edges when they're going to edge paint. I do. And so that's what I'm going to do. I'm only going to do one side so that I can stand it up and kind of show you guys. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to bevel. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take 320 grit sandpaper and I'm going to sand this down, but I'm not going to go any further than 320. And this is all, I'm only speaking as usual, just from personal experience. I'm not trying to give you any absolutes here, so what I say isn't gospel. But I've found that if I do anything over 320, like if I go up to 600, it's just a little too smooth for the edge paint to kind of grab onto. And so it peels off a little bit easier in my experience. So we're just going to go to 320. And then you can see we're kind of smooth here. If you do have like little scragglies, you could just take a lighter and kind of run it along the edge and that'll just burn them up. So I have my edge paint here. I've poured a little into the cap and we're going to be using just a scratch awl to apply it this time. We're not going to use the roller. The first coat I'm going to go fairly lightly. It's almost like a scratch coat, right? When you're making a cake. What we want to do with this one is we're basically just using this as a primer. And they do sell, Weaver doesn't, but different brands sell like a clear primer so that you can like fill in all the gaps and stuff with just a base of like a neutral color or a clear. And then you can put like your tinted stuff over top of it. I don't know, I've never used it, so I don't know if it's like thicker to fill it in more. I would assume it probably is. But what I do is, I just do like a scratch coat where I'm kind of gently pushing it into the grain of into the fibers of the leather. And my goal is to get as much as I can to kind of get in there and really stick well. Now, when you bevel the edges, you know, it's a little bit harder to do the edge, to get a crisp edge. But that's why I'm not using the roller, that's why I'm using an awl. And you can see, you have the awl, the reason you use an awl is because you have that line, right? So you can't really go super far over that edge. I did a little bit there. And I'll show you how to get that. You can usually get that off too. But it helps you keep a crisp line because you have a curve that you're applying it to. And so the paint isn't going to go past where the curve stops unless you overload your awl with edge paint. So you can see I'm just slowly working my way down. And you can use one of those little roller pen things if you want to. This is just how I'm doing it because I don't have one of those. And it does take time. So this is our scratch coat. And we're going to go, I'm not going very I wouldn't call it sparingly. I'm just definitely doing my best to extend the edge paint as much as I can and really push it into that fiber. So once our paint is applied, we need to obviously wait for it to dry. Now, there are a couple ways that you can kind of do this next step, right? The traditional French way is you have an alcohol burner and basically a spade tool, and you would heat this up, and then you would use it as heat to kind of smooth this out. I am not good at that. I've just never been good at it. So what I do is I take a heat gun while it's still kind of damp. I put it on the lowest setting. And now heat guns get really hot, so you don't want to hold this very close. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of go back and forth for a minute or two. And in my mind, this is more about the heat than it is like the fan, I guess, the blowing part of it. It just seems like when you add heat, the paint sets a little bit better on the edges. So I just find this cheap, it's like 25 bucks, heat gun. It really does the trick. And you're going to see me doing this in between each layer. And I just want to make it specifically clear that it's more about the heat than it is the blowing motion, I guess, the hairdryer aspect of it all. So that's all we're going to do on that first coat. And then if we are dry to the touch, which the first coat usually dries pretty quickly because we're like really pushing it in there. So we're dry to the touch. We're going to apply our second coat before we do any sanding. And what we're doing here is we're really just building up our base because we need something to sand off. Ideally, if you can see, I don't know how close you can get, you see all those nooks and crannies there? So the goal is to fill everything with paint and then sand it down and level it. So we're getting all those little fibers taken care of that are just a natural part of the leather. As you can see with 2 coats, we're actually rocking and rolling here. You could totally kind of call that good and that's it, but I want this glassy. So I'm going to go back with my 320 gun. I'm going to basically stick with 320 the whole time. And the thing is, we don't want this on thick, right? We want to take off as much as we can when we're sanding this. Because if you get it built up super thick, it's just, it's almost like having like a rubber bumper on the piece. And so it'll dent, and then when it dents, like over time, it can peel off. So the thinnest we can get this is what we're after. So I'm going to sand this down, and if you can zoom in, you can kind of see where you'll have shiny spots, and that's where we need to keep sanding, right? But then we have flat spots, and we're starting to, with those 2 coats of paint, we're starting to smooth over that fiber, which we left a little bit so that we can get good adhesion for the edge paint. So I'm just going to kind of keep doing this. I'm not applying a lot of pressure because this paint is only 15 minutes old. If you let this sit overnight, you can go to town on it. I'm kind of just, I'm living on the edge a little bit here. And I'm happy with how this is with the stage that this is to apply our 3rd coat of paint. I'd say overall we're probably going to be doing 4 to 5 coats total if I do my job right. So we just go back to the paint, and I'm just going to go through and apply another coat. Okay, and so after our 3rd coat, you can see, basically after the 2nd coat, especially with this exact touch edge paint, whenever you want to stop, you can stop, right? But our goal here is how do you get glassy, seamless edges? So that just entails a lot of coats, sanding, coat, sanding, coat. So this is our 3rd coat, but only our 2nd time sanding. And I'm going to do the same thing again. Light pressure, because this has only been dry for about 10 minutes. And back and forth, making sure to focus on all parts of this evenly. And you can see now, after our 3rd application of paint, we're starting to even out much quicker than last time. So what I'm going to do is, because if I wiggle it this way, so you can kind of see our edges, they're good. We're just trying to get all this little stuff in the middle because we glued 2 pieces together, and that's why I did that. I didn't want to do it on just one piece because most of the time you're going to be edge painting multiple pieces stuck together. And even if you sand this totally flush, your biggest problem area is going to be that little gap in between. We want to make that seam go away. But I'm just going to go through and do a little spot filling here. Not a lot, but any little nooks and crannies that I see that are a little too deep and like I'm starting to sand way into the leather around them to try to get down to their level, that's when it's usually time to add in just some light selective paint before we do our final coat. So you can see there, we got a bunch of our spots filled. If you want, you can go over, like, for a little added protection, all the spots you sanded through, you can just kind of throw a little paint on there. But you don't need to do that part because we're going to do a pretty heavy flood coat on our last coat. And that'll give you plenty of paint to do your final sanding. So with our spot fills dry, it's just more of the same. We're just going to lightly sand, but what we should start to see is now that we've filled in those peaks, we should get a much smoother finish overall. And I'm going to do this in sections, kind of lightly going back and forth. Okay, so as you can see, I sanded a lot. And this, once you do your spot fill, if you've built it up enough, remember when I said we don't want a lot of paint on this in the end. So all this stuff we're sanding down, it is smooth as glass, right? So that's fine, but we don't want a lot of paint on this. We don't want layers and layers and layers and layers when it's done. So it is important to make sure that if you're going to go this route to get a glassy edge, you're really not being sort of light-handed with it. But as you can see now, we have basically, there's a little tiny bit right there, which you're never going to be able to get it all out. For our intents and purposes, I think that's okay. And we have a little tiny bit right here too. But you really, that's why I like using the lighter sandpaper, because you can really go at it and take a tiny bit off at a time. It takes a little more time, but it's much more accurate. So there we go. Now we're ready for our final coat. What I think is going to be our final coat. We're definitely getting super, super close. So we're going to apply a heavier coat now, because the goal is we're going to put this coat on. We're going to let it dry overnight. I like to let my stuff cure overnight. You can it's probably overkill, but I'm going to put my final coat on. It's going to be pretty heavy. I'm not going to put no fans, no nothing. I'm just going to let it cure overnight. In my opinion, that's the best way to do it. If you can, it's like concrete, it's slow cure. Tomorrow morning, we're going to come back with our sandpaper, do a light sand, and I'll show you how we get that gloss, because it comes from sanding, but it comes from a second product that is a household product, and that's where the shine comes from. So, last step for today, before Kaylina goes home and I go to the workshop and make some bags for you guys that you've ordered, is you can see I'm doing a little bit of a heavier coat, and I'm doing the whole thing. And the goal is here, once we're done painting this, as it dries, this should be fairly, if we do it right, it should be fairly glossy on its own without any sanding once it's dried. And it definitely should be hiding that seam between the two layers. But you can see here how we have leather coming through on the sides, but in the middle we have a thick coat. And that's really essentially because we have that seam in the middle. That's just always how they end up looking once you've sanded them down for the final time. I don't know if it's maybe something just because of the way I do things, or if it's the same for everybody. But in my experience, that kind of always happens.
I feel like I can see the sun setting as you're doing that.
Right? Jeez,
It's so dark.
Gotta love daylight savings time. Okay. So it's going to look a little lumpy, but you have to remember that like the whole process of this drying is all of the liquid evaporating. So it looks lumpy, but unless your edge coat is like kind of, if it gets old, it'll get a little bit like gummy, and this is brand new, so unless it gets to that point, you're going to see a little waviness, but you just got to let it dry, and all that water comes out, and it'll be even when it dries. So that's going to be, well, I'm not saying, I almost did like an outro, but you're not leaving. Kaylina is.
Got some renegade cranberry picking to do.
Yeah, Kaylina's going to go to a bog that she doesn't own and steal cranberries.
I'm not stealing them.
She's borrowing them.
It's a defunct bog.
All right. While the cranberry lady over here is going to go do her thing, I'm going to go get to working, and we will see you in the morning. Okay, so it's the next day, and as you can see, Kaylina got her cranberries. So this is how shiny this looks with our fourth coat on. And honestly, like, if you didn't sand this to finish it, people would have no idea. But we're going to sand it. So I have I think this is 600 grit, and we're going to do the same thing now, but I'm using a much lighter grit because I really don't want to I don't want to sand through to leather again with our final coat. Now, if you do, you just put a little bit more on and, do another coat. It's no biggie. But using a finer grit sandpaper, it's like wet sanding a car or any sort of paint or anything. Now we're really just going in and fine tuning it and really smoothing it out. And I'm excited because the secret step, it's not mine, I actually learned it from someone else a few years ago, but the secret step is next, and this is the total game changer part for edge work, for painted edge work, for me at least. So, I don't know if you can see this. So you can see basically what we're doing now is we just want this edge to be matte. right? So we want to get all those little shiny spots. If we can, I'm not going to go too crazy so I don't burn through the paint, but if we can, or if I can, I'm going to try to get this whole thing matte, and that'll let me kind of know that we're fairly level. And because this sandpaper is so light, you don't have to do the whole thing. If you want to do like little spots, you can kind of go through and just get the little spots. So this is how we're going to finish this edge. Really simple. I just have some isopropyl alcohol, pretty high, 91%. You don't want to use like watered down stuff in my experience. I'm just going to dampen a paper towel, not going to soak it, and watch this. So the rubbing alcohol basically removes a tiny bit of the edge paint. And this works with most edge paint brands that I've tried. I've never tried a brand that it doesn't work with. But it's a really simple way. Usually what I would do before I learned this trick, I would sand, 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 coat, 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 sand, coat, and then my last coat would have to be like perfect. Because any imperfection, if I sanded it out, I didn't know how to make it shiny again. This shine stays, like it's permanent. This is a single layer that I did, and it's a few weeks old. The shine, it seems like it's going to go away when you rub the alcohol on it, but it does not. So there you go. That's as close to a mirror edge as I can get personally, and that's how you do it. And then if we take our knife here and we cut off a little piece to get a cross section, you can see, oh, I don't know if you can see, maybe Kaylina can get in close enough. You can see on this edge, here we'll use this, actually, can't point with that. You can see how thin our layers actually are. It seems to be kind of common when people try to get this mirror finish that they'll just layer and layer and layer and layer, 8, 9 layers. I've been there. And the problem with that is that your edge paint gets so thick that it's rubber at that point. I mean, I don't know if it's actually rubber, but it acts like rubber, so when you touch it, it dents. When you do it this way, you're able to keep a nice thin layer. Now, as one little additional thing, on the other side, this is 2 coats of edge paint. I sanded in between. What I didn't do is sand the second layer. So what I want to do is we're going to take that same 600 grit, we're going to sand it and put the rubbing alcohol on it so you can see what it looks like if you're not going for like a 5-layer mirror finish and you don't have the time. If you want to just do 2 quick coats sanding in between, we'll be able to see what the rubbing alcohol does, because even at 2 coats, this technique gives you a formidable shine. You do still have a little bit of texture, of course, because 2 coats is not enough to completely bury the grain of the leather on the edge. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to give this a little bit of a sand with our 600 grit. Just making sure to kind of get as much of the shine off, and we are going to burn through a little bit, just because there isn't a lot of paint on there. And then I'm going to flip my rag over, or my paper towel, a little bit of that rubbing alcohol, and this is what 2 coats is going to look like. And you can go a couple times, and it'll smooth it out even more, because what you're doing, yeah, I mean, it's basically like paint thinner, right? But it's very, very light with its effects, so you don't remove a ton of paint, you just shine it up. So you see we have a little bit of burn through there, and of course if you did a heavier coat on your second coat, you could avoid that. But, you know, you still get a really good result with just 2 coats. Now, is it the same as this? Of course it's not. But it's a lot less work. Now the one thing is, when you do this, because you are sort of melting the edge paint, you don't want to touch it. I just touched it a little bit there, you get fingerprints, it ends up being sticky. And so you have to wait for it to almost kind of like dry again. But that's it, guys. That's how I get shiny painted edges. And the whole trick is just a little rubbing alcohol. That's all you need. And so that's going to be it. If you want, you can add a little bit of beeswax and polish that up a little bit further. That I would probably recommend if you're doing just 2 coats. But for the 4.5 coat version, you really don't need it. And here's our single layer in comparison, actually. Why is this even here? Here, we'll put that like that. There we go. So remember, 91% isopropyl alcohol, and we are using Weaver's Exact Touch Edge Paint. Nothing super fancy. I really like this edge paint. A couple of you asked how our pincushion was doing. It hasn't peeled at all, and this thing gets tossed around the bench all the time. And it's been 6 months maybe. So far, this edge paint's doing really, really well in our testing. I would highly recommend it. So thank you guys so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.